The grey morning settled over Thornfield Manor like a shroud, its autumn mist clinging to the weathered stone walls and creeping through the overgrown gardens where roses had long since ceased to bloom with any enthusiasm. Inside the grand estate, silence reigned as it always did, broken only by the measured footsteps of a solitary figure moving through halls too vast for one person's existence. Evelyn Ashworth. No, Evelyn Thornfield now, though the name still felt foreign on her tongue after 6 years, descended the sweeping staircase with the practiced grace of a woman who had learned to make no sound, to take up no space, to exist as little more than a ghost haunting the corridors of her own home. Her dove-grey morning dress whispered against the marble steps, and she trailed one pale hand along the banister, feeling the cold smoothness beneath her fingertips, a sensation she had memorized through countless identical mornings. The breakfast room awaited her with its single place setting, the silver gleaming with an almost mocking perfection, arranged by servants who had learned years ago not to set a second chair, not to harbour hope that the master of the house might join his wife for even this simple ritual. She took her seat and gazed at the empty chair across from her, its burgundy velvet cushion perfectly smooth, untouched, and felt that familiar hollowness settle in her chest, not pain anymore, for pain required fresh wounds, and these had scarred over long ago into something duller, something that simply was. Through the tall windows, she could see the east wing where Adrian's study remained perpetually closed, the heavy oak door, a barrier more impenetrable than any lock, and she knew without looking that he was there, and had been there since before dawn, would remain there until well after she retired for the evening. Asterisk. This is my life, asterisk, she thought, not with bitterness but with the flat acceptance of one who had ceased fighting against the tide. Asterisk. This has been my life for 2,190 days, asterisk. She had stopped counting somewhere around the 1,000th, but the number had etched itself into her consciousness anyway, each day adding its weight to the collection. The marriage had been arranged, as such things were in their circles, her father and his father meeting over brandy and cigars, discussing mergers and alliances with the same detached interest one might employ when selecting wallpaper. She had been 19, still foolish enough to harbour romantic notions, still young enough to believe that proximity might breed affection, that time might soften the stern lines of her husband's face. But Adrian Thornfield had taken her as his wife, and then proceeded to treat her as one might treat an unwanted piece of furniture, acknowledged in the most perfunctory sense, maintained out of duty, but never truly seen, never valued, never touched, except for that single, clinical wedding night that had fulfilled obligation and nothing more. Now, as she lifted her teacup with hands that no longer trembled, Evelyn watched through the morning-room window as a carriage was brought around, watched as her husband emerged from the side entrance and climbed aboard without so much as a glance toward the house, toward the windows where she sat, toward the wife he had married for reasons she had never understood and likely never would. The carriage rolled away down the tree-lined drive, and Evelyn remained perfectly still, a portrait of elegant abandonment, knowing he would not return until darkness fell, knowing that when he did, he would not seek her out, knowing that tomorrow would dawn exactly like today, and the day after, and the day after that, stretching forward into a future as grey and cold as this autumn morning, as empty as the chair that would never hold him, as silent as the words that would never pass between them. The memory rose unbidden as Evelyn's fingers found the golden band encircling her fourth finger, turning it absently, as she had done 10,000 times before, the metal warm from her skin, yet somehow always feeling cold, alien, a shackle disguised as a symbol of union. 6 years dissolved like morning mist, and she was 19 again, standing in the grand cathedral with its soaring arches and jeweled light filtering through stained glass, transforming the ancient stones into something almost magical, almost capable of blessing the travesty unfolding within its walls. She had worn her mother's dress, altered to fit her slender frame, the ivory silk cascading around her like sea foam, and she had dared, foolish, naive girl, to hope that perhaps this arrangement might become something more, that the tall, dark-haired man waiting at the altar might look at her with something other than the cool indifference she had witnessed during their 3 brief, chaperoned meetings. But when she had walked down that endless aisle on her father's arm, her heart fluttering with nerves and that stubborn, resilient hope that youth carries like a torch into darkness, Adrian Thornfield had watched her approach with eyes as grey and unmoved as winter stone, his jaw set in a hard line, his posture rigid with something that she would later recognize as barely suppressed anger, though at whom or what she could not fathom. The ceremony had proceeded with mechanical precision, his responses delivered in a flat, emotionless tone that sent the first tendrils of dread curling through her chest, and when the vicar pronounced them man and wife, Adrian's kiss had been a mere brush of lips against hers, cold and perfunctory, over before it began, and then he had turned away as if she had already ceased to exist. The wedding breakfast had been an elaborate affair, her father and his business associates holding court at one end of the long table, while Adrian spoke in low tones with his solicitor, and it was then, while servants circulated with champagne and delicate pastries, that she had overheard the words that would haunt her for years to come. The merger is complete then, the properties consolidated, the debts settled, spoken by a portly gentleman with mutton chop whiskers, and her father's response, slightly slurred with drink. Indeed, indeed, Thornfield got what he wanted, and I've secured my interests, a satisfactory arrangement all around. She had felt something crack inside her chest that day, some fragile thing she hadn't known she was carrying, but the worst was yet to come, for that first night, when she had waited in the vast bedroom of Thornfield Manor, wearing the delicate nightgown her mother had pressed into her hands, with tearful instructions she was too embarrassed to fully articulate, Adrian had entered the room with the demeanor of a man attending to an unpleasant but necessary task. He had claimed his marital rights in silence, without tenderness, without even meeting her eyes, and when it was over, he had risen, dressed, and left her there in the darkness, alone with her tears and the dawning realization that she had been sold into a loveless prison with no possibility of parole. Now, back in the present morning, Evelyn released the ring and let her hand fall to her lap. The weight of 6 years pressing down upon her shoulders like stones, each one carved with a hope abandoned, a dream relinquished, a part of herself she had learned to bury in order to survive the slow suffocation of a marriage that was marriage in name only, wondering, as she did every morning, how many more years she would wear this band, this symbol of hollow vows, this golden circle of beautiful lies. The days unfurled with monotonous predictability, each one a mirror of the last, and Evelyn had learned to fill the empty hours with small rituals that gave shape to the shapeless void of her existence. After breakfast, she would don her gardening gloves and venture into the grounds where the roses struggled against neglect, and she would prune and tend them with a devotion that the servants whispered was touching in its futility. For what purpose did beauty serve when no one remained to admire it? Yet she persisted, finding in the soil and the thorns something honest, something that responded to care even if nothing else in her life did. And by mid-morning her fingers would be stained with earth, her cheeks flushed from exertion, alive in a way she never felt within the manor's oppressive walls. The library became her sanctuary in the afternoon hours, that vast room with its floor-to-ceiling shelves holding thousands of volumes that Adrian never touched, and she would lose herself in worlds created by minds far removed from her own suffering, traveling to places she would never see, loving characters who loved freely in return, living vicariously through ink and paper and imagination. Mrs. Brennan, the housekeeper who had served the Thornfield family for 3 decades, would sometimes pause in the doorway with fresh tea, and Evelyn would catch the older woman's expression, a mixture of pity and helpless sorrow that made her feel simultaneously comforted and pathetic. For even the servants knew the truth of her marriage, had witnessed her attempts over the years to bridge the chasm between herself and her husband. She had tried, God knows she had tried, in those first months and then years, appearing at his study door with offerings of tea, with questions about his day, with invitations to walk the gardens or attend the theatre, and each time he had dismissed her with barely concealed impatience, his responses clipped and cold, his eyes never quite meeting hers, until she had learned to stop asking, stop hoping, stop expecting anything beyond civil indifference. The transformation had been gradual, like a flower closing its petals against the frost, the hopeful bride slowly calcifying into a woman who had learned that survival meant asking for nothing, expecting nothing, being nothing more than a decorative fixture in a house that would never be a home. But she had found her small rebellions, her tiny acts of self-preservation that kept some essential part of her alive beneath the layers of resignation. the music she played on the pianoforte when Adrian was away, pouring her loneliness into Chopin and Debussy until the notes became tears she could not shed. The letters she wrote to her cousin in Bath, carefully editing out the despair, and the garden that bloomed despite everything, a testament to the stubborn persistence of life, even in the most inhospitable conditions. It was on one such afternoon, as she sat in the library with a volume of Keats open in her lap, the autumn light slanting through the windows in golden bars that seemed to cage her in beauty, that Mrs. Brennan entered with the silver salver bearing the afternoon post, and atop the small pile of correspondence lay a cream envelope with an ornate seal, an invitation to the Haverford Ball, the first grand event of the social season, and Evelyn stared at it for a long moment, her heart beginning to beat with something that might have been hope or might have been fear, wondering if she dared to step back into the world beyond these walls, to remember what it felt like to be seen. The invitation lay on the small writing desk in Evelyn's chambers, propped against the inkwell where she had placed it after carrying it upstairs, and for 3 days it had remained there, untouched, while she circled the decision like a wary animal approaching something that might be trap or treasure. The prospect of attending filled her with a paralyzing ambivalence, for the Haverford Ball would be attended by everyone of consequence in the county, which meant exposure, scrutiny, the inevitable whispers that followed her whenever she appeared in society as the mysteriously neglected wife of Adrian Thornfield, and worse, the possibility of Adrian himself being present, which would mean enduring in public what she endured in private, his studied indifference, his gaze that slid past her as if she were furniture, his conversations with everyone except the woman who bore his name. She remembered, with a sick feeling in her stomach, the opera performance 2 years prior, when she had attended with her cousin visiting from Bath, and Adrian had been there in a box across the theatre with business associates, and during the interval when she had crossed paths with him in the corridor, he had nodded to her with the polite disinterest one might show a vague acquaintance, then turned immediately to continue his conversation, leaving her standing there burning with humiliation while curious eyes catalogued her shame. Yet something in her rebelled against allowing fear and past pain to dictate her choices, some stubborn spark that had survived 6 years of slow suffocation. And when her lady's maid, Sarah, came to help her dress for dinner that evening, the girl had noticed the invitation and said, with uncharacteristic boldness, "You should attend, milady. You deserve to dance and laugh and live like the young woman you are, not moulder away in this great tomb of a house." And though Evelyn had gently chided her for the impertinence, Sarah's words had struck something deep and true. That night, alone in the darkness, Evelyn made her decision with a clarity that surprised her. She would attend the ball, not to please Adrian, not to perform the role of dutiful wife for society's benefit, not even with any hope that her husband might notice or care, but for herself. For the girl she had been before this marriage had carved out her insides and left her hollow, for the woman she might still become, if she dared to remember how to want something, anything, beyond mere survival. The following morning, she summoned Sarah, and together they went through her wardrobe, pushing aside the subdued colors she had adopted over the years, the grays and mauves and dusty blues that helped her fade into the background until they found it. Still wrapped in tissue at the back of the armoire, a gown of deep emerald silk that her mother had commissioned for her trousseau, never worn because Adrian had made it abundantly clear that he had no interest in taking her anywhere that required such finery. Sarah gasped when they lifted it into the light, the fabric shimmering like water, the décolletage daring but elegant, the waist fitted to perfection, and Evelyn felt something flutter in her chest that might have been anticipation or terror, or perhaps both intertwined. On the evening of the ball, she stood before her mirror as Sarah arranged her dark hair in an elaborate style, weaving pearls through the curls, and when she finally descended the stairs in the emerald gown, with her mother's diamond earrings catching the lamplight, she felt almost like a stranger to herself, almost like someone who might be worth noticing, and she walked out to the waiting carriage with her head held high, knowing that Adrian had left hours earlier without a word, without an invitation for her to accompany him, without even the pretense that they were a married couple, and for once the knowledge brought not pain but a fierce, liberating anger that carried her forward into the night. The Haverford mansion blazed with light against the darkness, every window ablaze with the glow of 1,000 candles, and as Evelyn's carriage drew closer, She could hear the strains of the orchestra drifting through the October night, the music mingling with the sound of laughter and conversation that spilled from the open doors where liveried footmen stood, receiving the endless stream of guests arriving in their finery. She stepped down from the carriage with Sarah's whispered encouragement still warming her heart, and as she ascended the marble steps alone, chin lifted, emerald silk rustling with each movement, she felt the weight of curious gazes turning toward her, heard the whispers beginning like a wave, "There is Mrs. Thornfield. How unusual to see her without her husband. How striking she looks. Have you ever seen her wear such a color? What can it mean?" And she pushed through the discomfort into the grand ballroom, where crystal chandeliers cast prismatic light across the polished floor, and the cream of society whirled and glided in elaborate patterns that seemed choreographed by some invisible hand. The room overwhelmed the senses with its opulence, the scent of hothouse roses competing with expensive perfumes, the visual feast of silks and satins in every jewel tone imaginable, the kaleidoscope of faces both familiar and strange, and Evelyn accepted a glass of champagne from a passing footman simply to have something to occupy her trembling hands, taking a position near one of the tall windows where she might observe without being immediately drawn into conversation that would require explanations she had no wish to give. It took only moments for her to locate Adrian across the vast space, his tall frame unmistakable even in the crowd, his dark evening clothes impeccably tailored, his posture radiating the cold authority that made men respect him and women find him formidable, and he stood in a circle of gentlemen engaged in what appeared to be serious discourse, probably about railways or mining investments, or whatever occupied the minds of men who measured worth in ledgers and contracts, and he had not noticed her arrival, had not even glanced toward the entrance, and the familiar ache of invisibility threatened to swallow her until she forced herself to look away, to focus instead on the music and on the dancers, on anything but the husband who could not see her. She was standing thus, champagne untouched, when a voice beside her said with genuine warmth, "Forgive my boldness, madam, but I cannot help but notice that you seem to be observing the festivities rather than partaking in them, and I wonder if you might honor me with a dance, for it seems a terrible waste for someone so gracefully presented to remain a spectator." And she turned to find a gentleman, perhaps 10 years her senior, with kind grey eyes and a gentle smile, someone she did not immediately recognize, though his bearing spoke of good breeding and sincere courtesy. He introduced himself as Lord William Ashford, recently returned from an extended stay in Italy following the death of his wife 3 years prior, and there was something in his manner that spoke of shared understanding, of someone who had known loss and emerged from it with compassion intact. And when he extended his hand with a questioning look, Evelyn hesitated for only a heartbeat before placing her gloved fingers in his palm, thinking that this small act of acceptance, this willingness to dance with a stranger who had asked kindly rather than out of obligation or pity, was itself a reclamation of something she had thought lost forever, a quiet declaration that she existed beyond the confines of her marriage, that she could be seen, could choose, could move through the world as herself, rather than as the shadow of a man who had never wanted her. Lord William Ashford led her onto the dance floor with the practiced grace of a gentleman who had waltzed in the finest ballrooms of Europe, his hand at her waist firm but respectful, his other hand cradling her gloved fingers with a gentleness that made her throat tighten unexpectedly. And as the orchestra began the familiar strains of a Viennese waltz, Evelyn found herself swept into the rhythm, her emerald skirts swirling around her legs like water, the chandelier light fragmenting into stars above them as they turned and turned again in patterns that required no thought, only surrender to the music's pull. William was perhaps an inch shorter than Adrian but moved with far more fluidity, and he guided her through the dance with such natural confidence that she felt graceful in his arms, felt almost beautiful, and when he spoke his voice was low enough that only she could hear over the swelling strings, asking her if she had been to Italy, whether she enjoyed music, what books had captured her attention lately, questions that seemed genuinely intended to know her rather than to fill silence with meaningless pleasantries, and she found herself answering with an openness that surprised her, telling him about her love of Gothic novels, though they were considered rather scandalous, about her attempts to learn Italian through grammar books in the library, about the garden where she spent her mornings tending roses that bloomed in defiance of the approaching winter. He listened with his full attention, his grey eyes warm with interest, and he told her in turn about the hill towns of Tuscany, where he had wandered after his wife's passing, about the art he had seen in Florence, about how grief had taught him that life must be lived fully in the present, because the future promised nothing. And there was such gentle wisdom in his words, such hard-won peace, that Evelyn felt something loosen in her chest, some knot of loneliness beginning to unravel in the presence of someone who saw her, truly saw her, not as an ornament or a means to an end, but as a person worthy of knowing. Across the ballroom, though she did not yet know it, Adrian had finally looked up from his discussion of railway investments, and his gaze had found her by some magnetic pull he did not understand, and the sight of his wife in the arms of another man struck him with the force of a physical blow, her face animated with genuine pleasure, her smile radiant in a way he had never witnessed, her body moving with a grace that seemed to mock the stiff, lifeless woman who haunted the corridors of their home, and something dark and possessive unfurled in his chest, something that felt uncomfortably like panic, like loss, like the terrible realization that one has discarded something precious and only recognized its value when seeing another reach to claim it. The waltz came to its conclusion with a final sweeping turn, and William bowed over Evelyn's hand with old-fashioned courtesy, his smile genuine as he thanked her for the honor of the dance. And then, with a directness that was both bold and respectful, he said, "Mrs. Thornfield, I wonder if you might permit me to call upon you at your convenience, for I find myself quite enchanted by our conversation and should very much like to continue our discussion of Italian literature and Gothic novels, if such a thing would not be too presumptuous of me to request." And Evelyn, still breathless from the dance and from the unfamiliar sensation of being treated as though her thoughts mattered, found herself saying yes before caution could intervene, watching as his face lit with pleasure before he escorted her from the floor, unaware that across the room her husband stood frozen, champagne glass forgotten in his hand, staring at her with the expression of a man who had just watched his entire world tilt on its axis and could not comprehend how he had failed to notice it, moving until this precise, irrevocable moment. Adrian stood motionless near the marble pillar, where the sight of his wife laughing had first arrested him, and he watched as Lord William Ashford led Evelyn toward the refreshment table with the solicitous attention of a man who actually cared whether she was thirsty, whether she was enjoying herself, whether she existed at all, and the rage that bubbled up in Adrian's chest was so unfamiliar and so unwelcome that for a moment he could not identify it, could only feel the terrible heat of it spreading through his veins like poison, and he realized with sudden horrifying clarity that he was jealous, profoundly and irrationally jealous of a man who had done nothing more than dance with a woman who was, by all legal and moral rights, not his to dance with at all. The memory came unbidden, as it always did, when he allowed himself to feel anything, the memory of his father's face when the creditors had come, when everything had been seized and sold, when the proud Thornfield name had been dragged through bankruptcy courts and scandal sheets, and his father's voice breaking as he explained that Richard Hartley had orchestrated it all, had used inside knowledge gained through friendship to destroy their shipping company and absorb its most profitable routes into his own empire, and the way his mother had wept silently in the drawing-room as their furniture was carried away piece by piece, and then the fever that had taken his father within the year, the grief and shame literally consuming him from within until there was nothing left but a shell in a borrowed coffin. Adrian had been 23 when he had sworn over that grave that he would have his revenge, that he would rebuild the Thornfield fortune through sheer will and ruthless business acumen, and that he would take from Richard Hartley something precious, something irreplaceable. And when the opportunity had come 6 years later to marry Hartley's only daughter, the girl he doted upon, the child he had spoiled and cherished and planned to see brilliantly matched, Adrian had seized it with cold calculation, had courted the business alliance while privately planning never to give Evelyn anything of himself, and to make her a prisoner in a loveless marriage, to ensure that her father would watch his beloved daughter wither in loneliness and know that it was Adrian Thornfield who had orchestrated her unhappiness. He had never looked at her properly, had never allowed himself to see her as anything but a symbol, a playing piece in his game of retribution, and even on their wedding day, when she had stood beside him in ivory silk, with hope trembling in her violet eyes, he had kept his gaze fixed somewhere over her head, had spoken his vows in a voice devoid of warmth, had turned away from her the moment propriety allowed, and had continued turning away for 6 years without once questioning whether his revenge was achieving anything beyond the slow erosion of his own humanity. But now, watching her across the ballroom as she smiled at something William said, watching the way candlelight caught in her dark hair and made her skin glow like pearl, watching her move with unconscious grace in that emerald gown that transformed her from the grey ghost who haunted his house into someone vibrant and alive and utterly beyond his reach, Adrian felt the foundation of his revenge crack and crumble, felt the satisfying certainty of his righteous anger drain away to leave only a terrible hollow awareness that he had won nothing, had proven nothing, had accomplished nothing except the destruction of an innocent woman who had never harmed him, who had been 18 years old and blameless when he had decided to use her as an instrument of punishment, and the revenge that had sustained him through 6 years of deliberate coldness now tasted like ash in his mouth, like the bitter dregs of a poison he had been drinking himself while believing he was administering it to his enemy. Adrian moved through the dispersing crowd with sudden purpose, his long strides carrying him toward where Evelyn stood beside Lord William Ashford near the terrace doors, and he arrived just as William was taking his leave with a courteous bow, and Adrian heard himself saying in a voice that sounded strange to his own ears, "The carriage is waiting, we should depart together." And he saw the flash of surprise in Evelyn's violet eyes, saw the way her posture stiffened almost imperceptibly as though bracing for some new cruelty, and William glanced between them with the keen perception of a man who recognized undercurrents he could not fully understand, before wishing them both a pleasant evening and disappearing into the crowd, leaving Adrian alone with his wife for the first time in he could not remember how long, the silence between them awkward and vast. She did not refuse him, though he saw her consider it, saw the calculation in her expression as she weighed the social impropriety of declining against whatever instinct warned her to maintain distance, and finally she inclined her head with cool politeness and allowed him to escort her toward the entrance, his hand hovering near but not touching the small of her back, and they waited in the marble foyer while a footman summoned their carriage, the sounds of the ball fading behind them until there was only the echo of their breathing and the distant clatter of horses on cobblestones. The carriage ride began in absolute silence, Evelyn arranging herself on the velvet seat with the careful precision of someone determined to occupy as little space as possible, her emerald skirts pooling around her like water, her gloved hands folded in her lap, her gaze fixed firmly on the window where the lamplit streets of London slid past in a blur of gold and shadow. And Adrian sat across from her rather than beside her, suddenly uncertain of everything, watching the play of light across her profile and trying to reconcile this elegant stranger with the ghost who drifted through his house leaving no impression, making no demands, asking nothing because she had learned that nothing would be given. He cleared his throat after several minutes of oppressive quiet, the sound loud and jarring in the confined space, and he said, "You dance beautifully. I had not realized." And even to his own ears the words sounded stilted and inadequate. The observation of a man commenting on a stranger at a party, rather than a husband speaking to his wife, and Evelyn's head turned slowly from the window, her expression carefully neutral as she regarded him with those remarkable eyes that held no warmth, no hope, only a polite blankness that cut him more deeply than anger would have done. "Thank you," she said, her voice soft and utterly devoid of inflection, and then she turned back to the window as though he had ceased to exist, and Adrian felt the dismissal like a physical blow, felt the walls she had built between them as solid and impenetrable as stone, and he realized with sudden painful clarity that this was his own work, his own careful construction, that he had spent 6 years teaching her not to expect anything from him, and could not now be surprised that she had learned the lesson perfectly, that she had transformed hope into resignation, and resignation into this terrible, courteous indifference that left no opening for connection, no vulnerability he might exploit to find his way back to some possibility of knowing her. He tried again, fumbling for words, saying something about the music having been well chosen, about the ballroom's decorations being tasteful, meaningless pleasantries that dissolved into the silence like rain into an ocean, and Evelyn responded with monosyllables, with brief acknowledgments that fulfilled the bare minimum requirements of conversation while offering nothing of herself, and he watched her profile in the flickering carriage light, He watched the way her jaw was set with the tension of someone enduring something unpleasant, and he understood that she was not being cruel or vindictive, but simply protecting herself, simply maintaining the emotional distance that was the only defense she had against a husband who had proven himself unworthy of trust, who had demonstrated through 6 years of systematic neglect that she meant nothing to him. And the irony of it all nearly choked him, the realization that in succeeding so completely in his revenge, he had lost something he had not known he wanted until it was too late to reclaim it. The carriage rolled to a stop before their townhouse, the gas lamps on either side of the door casting pools of amber light across the steps, and a footman hurried to open the carriage door and lower the steps, and Evelyn gathered her skirts with practiced efficiency and descended without waiting for Adrian's assistance, without looking back to see if he followed. And by the time he emerged from the carriage, she was already climbing the front steps with the bearing of a woman returning to a prison she had briefly escaped, and the butler opened the door to admit them into the chandelier-lit foyer, where the grandfather clock was just chiming midnight, and Evelyn paused only long enough to murmur, "Good night," before turning toward the staircase that led to her separate wing of the house, her separate bedroom, her separate life, and Adrian stood frozen in the foyer watching her ascend, watching the emerald silk disappear around the landing, listening to the fading whisper of her footsteps on the carpet, and he remained there long after she had gone, alone in the vast, empty space, surrounded by all the trappings of wealth and success that suddenly seemed utterly meaningless, wondering how he had become a man who could stand in his own house and feel like an unwelcome guest, how he had built a prison for his wife, only to discover he had locked himself inside it as well. 3 days passed before Lord William Ashford appeared at the Thornfield townhouse, his card presented by the butler to Evelyn as she sat in the morning room attempting to focus on her embroidery and failing utterly because her mind kept circling back to the strange carriage ride home, to Adrian's awkward attempts at conversation, to the confusion of not knowing what any of it meant or whether it meant anything at all, and when the butler announced that Lord Ashford was calling and requesting the honor of her company, Evelyn felt a peculiar mixture of relief and apprehension wash over her. Relief, because William represented something uncomplicated and genuine in her increasingly bewildering existence, and apprehension, because she was aware, in some dim corner of her consciousness, that receiving him might provoke consequences she could not yet foresee. She instructed the butler to show Lord Ashford to the drawing-room and to send for her lady's maid as chaperone, propriety demanding that even a married woman not receive a gentleman caller entirely alone, and she took a moment to smooth her morning dress of pale blue muslin and check her reflection in the mirror above the mantelpiece, seeing there a woman who looked composed and serene despite the turmoil churning beneath the surface, and then she made her way to the drawing-room, where William stood examining a portrait on the wall, his tall frame elegant in a coat of charcoal grey, and he turned when she entered, with a smile that was warm and utterly without calculation, without agenda, without the weight of 6 years of silence and coldness that made every interaction in this house feel like navigating a minefield. They settled into conversation with surprising ease, William speaking of the art exhibition at the Royal Academy that he had attended the previous day, describing the new works by Turner with genuine enthusiasm and asking whether Evelyn had interest in such things, and she found herself responding with more animation than she had shown in years, telling him about her own love of watercolors, about the landscape paintings she had attempted in her early months of marriage before the isolation had drained even that small pleasure from her life. And William listened with the focused attention of someone who actually cared about her answers, who saw her as a person with thoughts and preferences and interior life rather than as a decorative object or a means to an end. Their discussion ranged from art to literature, William mentioning that he had recently read a new novel that he thought she might enjoy, a romance set in the Scottish Highlands that his sister had recommended, and Evelyn confessed her fondness for poetry, for Wordsworth and Keats, for verses that captured beauty and melancholy in equal measure, and they discovered a shared appreciation for travel literature, for accounts of distant lands and exotic cultures, William describing his time in India, with the East India Company, and the strange beauty of the subcontinent, and Evelyn speaking wistfully of places she had only read about, of Venice and Paris and the Swiss Alps, destinations that existed for her only in books and paintings, because her marriage had confined her to an emotional prison even as it provided material comfort. What neither of them noticed during their animated conversation was the figure that appeared briefly at the study window overlooking the street. Adrian, having heard the sound of an unfamiliar masculine voice drifting up from the drawing room and having moved to investigate with a churning sensation in his gut that he recognized now as jealousy, that primitive, possessive feeling that had no rational basis, given that he had forfeited any claim to Evelyn's attention or affection through 6 years of deliberate neglect, and he stood watching as William eventually emerged from the house and helped Evelyn into her cloak for a turn around the garden, the two of them walking the gravel paths between the rose bushes with the easy companionship of old friends. And Adrian gripped the window frame until his knuckles went white, watching his wife smile at another man, watching her gesture expressively as she spoke, watching her exhibit all the animation and warmth that he had never seen directed toward himself, because he had never given her reason to offer it. When William finally took his leave with a deep bow and a promise to send her the novel they had discussed, when he handed Evelyn a crisp white card with an invitation to a gallery opening the following week, when she accepted with a smile that transformed her entire countenance into something radiant and alive, Adrian turned away from the window, feeling as though he had witnessed something being stolen from him, something he had thrown away himself and now desperately wanted back, and the bitter irony of it settled over him like a shroud, the knowledge that his revenge had succeeded so perfectly that he had made his wife a stranger, and now that he wanted to know her, to claim some small corner of her attention, he had no idea how to begin, no idea how to compete with a man who offered kindness and respect and genuine interest. The simple things that Adrian had withheld as weapons and now understood were the very things that built the connections he had never known he wanted. The following morning, Evelyn descended to breakfast at her customary hour, expecting the usual solitary meal, and her newspaper and tea awaiting her at the small table by the window where she had taken her morning meals alone for 6 years. And she stopped short in the doorway of the breakfast room to find Adrian already seated there, not at the head of the long formal dining table where he occasionally took his meals, but at her small, intimate table, and he looked up when she entered with an expression that might have been hopefulness or might have been uncertainty, and he said, "Good morning. I thought we might breakfast together." And Evelyn felt confusion wash over her like cold water, because this was not their pattern, this was not how their household operated, and she moved slowly to her chair, trying to understand what this alteration meant, what fresh cruelty or strange game he might be playing now. The meal proceeded in excruciating awkwardness, Adrian attempting conversation with the stilted formality of someone who had forgotten or perhaps never learned how to engage in casual domestic exchange, asking whether she had slept well, commenting on the weather with observations so banal they might have come from a stranger, making polite chit-chat in a railway carriage, and Evelyn responded with careful monosyllables, her wariness a shield she had constructed over years of disappointment and could not simply lower because her husband had inexplicably decided to notice her existence, and she watched him covertly over the rim of her teacup, trying to discern what had changed, what catalyst had transformed 6 years of systematic neglect into this sudden, awkward attention that felt more disorienting than comforting. The pattern repeated itself over subsequent days, Adrian appearing at meals he had never before attended, lingering in rooms where she sat reading, making fumbling attempts at dialogue that revealed how little he knew of her life, of her thoughts, of anything beyond the most superficial facts of her existence. And one evening at dinner he asked with the air of someone attempting genuine interest, "How did you occupy yourself today? What activities filled your hours?" And Evelyn looked at him across the candlelit table, feeling a surge of something that might have been anger or might have been bitter amusement, because the question revealed the vast chasm of, in his ignorance, revealed that he had no idea how she spent her days, her weeks, her years, in this house where she lived as a ghost, and she said with careful neutrality, "Much as I occupy myself every day, I tended the garden, I read, I practiced my music, I embroidered, I managed the household accounts that someone must attend to," and she saw him flinch slightly at the implication that she had been performing these duties, always, invisibly, while he pursued his business and his revenge and whatever else filled his purposeful existence. That night, after Evelyn had retired and the house had settled into its customary silence, Adrian sat alone in his study with a glass of whiskey he did not drink, staring at the ledgers before him without seeing the neat columns of figures, and he confronted with brutal honesty the magnitude of what he had done, not merely the original sin of marrying her for revenge, but the compounded cruelty of the 6 years that followed, the systematic erasure of her personhood, the deliberate cultivation of this vast, unbridgeable distance that he now desperately wanted to cross and had no idea how to navigate. And he understood with painful clarity that presence alone was not enough, that appearing at meals and making stilted conversation could not undo years of absence, could not rebuild trust that had never been established in the first place, could not transform a wife who had learned to expect nothing into a woman willing to risk hoping again. And the realization settled over him like a weight, the knowledge that he had broken something precious before he ever knew its value, and he had no blueprint for repair, no map to guide him back to possibilities he had destroyed before they could take root. The gallery opening took place on a mild afternoon, when spring seemed to be cautiously asserting itself against winter's lingering claims, and Evelyn arrived with Lord William in his carriage, the propriety of their arrangement beyond reproach, given that she had brought her maid along as chaperone, and that their destination was a public exhibition, attended by half of society. Yet she felt a flutter of something that might have been nervousness, or might have been the unfamiliar sensation of anticipation, as William handed her down from the carriage and offered his arm for the walk into the elegant building that housed the collection. The gallery itself was a marvel of light and space, tall windows allowing the afternoon sun to illuminate the paintings that hung on cream-colored walls, and Evelyn moved through the rooms with William at her side, genuinely absorbed in the artwork before them, a collection of landscapes and portraits by both established masters and promising newcomers, and she found herself engaged in the kind of thoughtful discussion she had missed desperately. William asking her opinion about the use of light in a particular seascape, she pointing out the emotional depth captured in a portrait of a young woman reading by a window, and for a stretch of time she forgot entirely about the strange tension that had invaded her household, forgot about Adrian's bewildering attempts at conversation, forgot about everything except the pleasure of shared aesthetic appreciation and intelligent discourse. They were standing before a particularly striking painting of the Thames at sunset, the water rendered in shades of gold and crimson, when Evelyn became aware of a familiar presence nearby, and she turned to find Adrian approaching with the carefully casual air of someone who wished to appear as though his attendance were mere coincidence, and he greeted them with formal politeness, claiming that he had business in this part of town and thought he might stop by the exhibition, having read favorable reviews in the morning papers. But Evelyn saw the tension in his jaw, the way his eyes flickered between her and William with barely concealed assessment, and she felt a strange shift in the atmosphere. The comfortable companionship she had been enjoying suddenly complicated by her husband's unexpected appearance. The three of them moved through the remaining rooms together, maintaining the outward appearance of cordial civility, both men behaving with impeccable correctness, yet Evelyn sensed the undercurrent running between them. The way William's comments about the art seemed designed to demonstrate his connection with her, his understanding of her tastes and preferences, and the way Adrian listened with increasing tension, occasionally interjecting observations that revealed he had no knowledge of her artistic interests, no foundation for the kind of easy dialogue that she and William shared, and she found herself in the peculiar position of feeling both uncomfortable with the barely concealed competition and strangely powerful, realizing that for the first time in her marriage she was not invisible, not forgotten, but rather the center of attention in a way that would have seemed impossible mere weeks ago. When the viewing concluded and they emerged into the softening light of late afternoon, William suggested tea at a nearby establishment, and Adrian immediately countered with the observation that he had his carriage waiting and would be honored to convey Lady Evelyn home. And she stood between them, feeling the weight of their expectant gazes, these two men who represented such different possibilities, William offering the safe harbor of proven kindness and genuine respect, Adrian offering nothing concrete except his sudden, inexplicable interest and the confusion of not understanding what had changed, or why it had changed, or whether it meant anything at all, and she made her choice based on propriety and prior arrangement, accepting William's invitation for tea while thanking Adrian politely for his offer, and she saw something flicker across her husband's face that might have been hurt or might have been frustration before he bowed with rigid formality and departed. The tea was pleasant enough, William making no reference to the awkward encounter, instead continuing their discussion of art and expanding into talk of an upcoming exhibition of Italian masters. But Evelyn found her attention fractured, part of her mind still processing the strange tableau at the gallery, the sight of Adrian appearing where he had no reason to be except to intrude upon her afternoon with William, and when William finally escorted her home in the gathering dusk, handing her down from the carriage with a warm smile and a reminder of his promise to send her a book of poetry they had discussed. She entered the house to find Adrian standing in the foyer, as though he had been waiting there, and their eyes met across the marble expanse, and neither spoke, but something passed between them in that silent exchange, something charged and uncomfortable and impossible to name, before Evelyn gathered her skirts and climbed the stairs to her chambers, while Adrian remained below, watching her ascent, with an expression of such complex emotion that even he could not have articulated what he was feeling, only that it burned in his chest like a brand, this jealousy and regret and desperate longing to reclaim something he had never valued until he saw another man appreciating what he had discarded. The weeks that followed the gallery opening settled into a pattern that would have seemed impossible just months earlier, William calling at the estate with a regularity that spoke to serious courtship intentions while remaining always within the bounds of strict propriety, bringing books he thought Evelyn might enjoy, inviting her to attend concerts and exhibitions with appropriate chaperonage, engaging her in the kind of thoughtful discourse that nourished a part of her soul that had been starving for years in this beautiful prison of a house, and simultaneously, Adrian increased his presence in her daily life, with a determination that bordered on desperation, appearing not just at meals now, but in the drawing room where she received William, in the garden where she walked in the afternoons, in the library where she spent her evenings, his attempts at conversation growing slightly less stilted with practice, though still marked by the fundamental awkwardness of two people who had lived as strangers under one roof for 6 years and had no foundation of shared experience, trust upon which to build. And Evelyn found herself caught between these two men like a rope pulled taut between opposing forces, William representing safety and proven kindness and the promise of a life where she would be valued and seen and cherished, Adrian representing only confusion and the treacherous stirrings of something she dared not name, something that whispered that perhaps the man she had married was finally becoming visible beneath the cold stranger who had ignored her for so long. And she did not trust these feelings, did not trust the sudden transformation, could not simply forget 6 years of systematic neglect because her husband had inexplicably decided she was worth noticing. The servants observed this strange triangle with poorly concealed fascination, their whispered conversations falling silent when Evelyn entered rooms, their knowing glances passing between them when William's carriage arrived or when Adrian emerged from his study. At the precise moment, Evelyn was receiving her guest, and Mrs. Henshaw, the housekeeper who had served the family for 30 years, remarked to the butler that she had never seen anything quite like it. The master suddenly acting like a husband after all this time, and wasn't it peculiar how men never valued what they had until they saw another man appreciating it? And the household staff divided into camps, some sympathizing with Lord William, who was clearly a gentleman of the first order and would make their lady a proper husband. Others noting that for all his faults the master seemed genuinely changed, genuinely suffering, genuinely attempting to breach the walls his own cruelty had constructed. Evelyn's internal conflict deepened with each passing day, her conversations with William leaving her feeling peaceful and appreciated, her interactions with Adrian leaving her feeling turbulent and confused and dangerously close to hoping again. And she found herself analyzing her own reactions with ruthless honesty, questioning whether what she felt toward Adrian was genuine attraction or merely the pathetic eagerness of a starved heart willing to accept crumbs from the man who had denied her sustenance, wondering whether choosing William would be wisdom or cowardice, whether choosing Adrian would be courage or foolishness. And she slept poorly during these weeks, lying awake in her chambers, staring at the ceiling and trying to untangle the knot of her emotions, trying to understand what she truly wanted versus what she thought she should want, trying to discern whether Adrian's transformation was real or temporary or simply a competitive response to another man's interest that would fade once the threat was eliminated. The household received invitations to a formal dinner party at the Ashworth estate, an event of some significance given Lady Ashworth's position in society, and the invitation included both Adrian and Evelyn with the explicit expectation that they would attend together as a married couple, and it also included Lord William among the dozen guests, and when Evelyn read the guest list, she felt a tightening in her chest, because she understood that this would be a test of sorts, a public stage upon which this private drama would play out before the eyes of society, and Adrian must have felt the same awareness, because when he encountered her in the hallway outside the breakfast room, he said with uncharacteristic directness, "The Ashworth dinner. I understand we are both invited. I hope you will allow me to escort you properly, as your husband." And there was something almost pleading beneath the formal words. And Evelyn looked at him, seeing the tension in his posture, the vulnerability he was learning to show, and she nodded her acceptance because she was still his wife, whatever else might be true, and she saw relief flash across his features before he mastered his expression, and they stood there in the hallway for a long moment, neither quite knowing what else to say, before Evelyn excused herself and continued to her chambers, while Adrian remained standing where she had left him, his hands clenched at his sides, his jaw tight with the growing desperation of a man who understood that he was running out of time to repair what he had so carelessly destroyed, who understood that the dinner party approaching might be his last opportunity to prove himself worthy of a second chance he had done nothing to deserve. The evening of the Ashworth dinner arrived with the crispness of early spring, and Evelyn dressed with unusual care in a gown of midnight blue silk that brought out the color of her eyes, her maid arranging her hair in an elegant style that was neither too youthful nor too severe, and when she descended the stairs, she found Adrian waiting in the foyer, already dressed in his evening clothes, and something passed across his face when he saw her, something that might have been admiration or wonder, or perhaps the belated recognition of what he had possessed all along without seeing, and he offered his arm with a formality that nonetheless held a tremor of genuine feeling, and they rode to the Ashworth estate in a silence that was less hostile than contemplative, each lost in thoughts of the evening ahead and what it might reveal. Lady Ashworth greeted them with the gracious warmth of a seasoned hostess, and Evelyn found herself thrust into a role she had not occupied in years, that of Adrian's wife in truth rather than merely in name, and she moved through the receiving of guests with a poise that came from good breeding and years of observing society, even while existing on its margins. And Adrian remained at her side with an attentiveness that did not escape notice, his hand occasionally finding the small of her back in a gesture of partnership. His responses to other guests' remarks, including references to "we" and "our household," in ways that acknowledged her presence and position, and she felt the strangeness of it, like an ill-fitting garment she was being asked to wear after years of comfortable solitude. When Lord William arrived, looking distinguished in his evening attire, he greeted them both with perfect courtesy, though his eyes lingered on Evelyn with a warmth that spoke volumes, and she saw Adrian stiffen almost imperceptibly beside her, his jaw tightening as William engaged her in conversation about a recent book of poetry he had sent her, and the three of them navigated the social niceties with the skill of well-trained performers, while beneath the surface currents of tension flowed like underground rivers, threatening to breach their banks. Dinner itself was an exercise in restraint, Evelyn seated between a baronet's widow and a young scholar of antiquities, Adrian positioned across the table, where he could observe her interactions, and William placed several seats away, yet managing somehow to catch her eye periodically with expressions of gentle encouragement, and the conversation flowed around topics of politics and art and the latest theatrical productions, and Evelyn contributed when called upon with intelligent observations that surprised some of the guests who had perhaps heard whispers of the strange marriage and expected to find her diminished or bitter, and she saw Adrian watching her with an intensity that bordered on hunger, seeing her perhaps as others saw her, gracious and articulate and quietly lovely, all the things he had deliberately refused to notice for 6 long years. When the ladies withdrew after dinner, leaving the gentlemen to their port and cigars, Lady Ashworth complimented Evelyn on her gown and her conversation, and then with the casual directness of old friendship said, "My dear, you seem quite transformed from the last time we met. There is a light in you that was absent before, and I confess I have observed certain changes in the dynamics of your household if the whispers are to be believed." And Evelyn felt heat rise to her cheeks but maintained her composure, replying only that life had indeed become more interesting of late, and Lady Ashworth smiled knowingly before the conversation moved to safer topics. When the gentlemen rejoined them, Lady Ashworth suggested that perhaps Lady Evelyn might honour them with a performance at the piano, for she had heard that Evelyn possessed considerable talent, though opportunities to display it had been sadly rare, and Evelyn felt every eye turned toward her, including Adrian's dark gaze and William's encouraging smile, and she rose with outward calm, though her heart beat rapidly because this too was a revelation, a displaying of a part of herself that Adrian had never asked about, had never cared to discover, and she moved to the beautiful instrument positioned near the windows and settled herself on the bench, her fingers finding the keys with the familiar ease of long practice, and she began to play a piece by Chopin, Nocturne in E-flat major, and the music filled the room like moonlight made audible, melancholic and beautiful and achingly expressive of emotions she had kept locked away for so long. And as she played, she forgot about her audience, forgot about the complicated tangle of her circumstances, forgot everything except the language of the music that spoke what words could not convey, the loneliness and longing, and the terrible tender hope that still lived somewhere deep within her wounded heart, despite all reasons for its extinction. The final notes of the Chopin Nocturne faded into silence, and for a moment the drawing-room remained perfectly still, as though the guests feared that any movement might shatter the spell the music had woven, and then applause broke out, genuine and appreciative, and Evelyn rose from the piano bench feeling oddly vulnerable, as though she had revealed more of herself than she had intended, and Lord William was the first to approach her, his eyes warm with understanding as he said, "That was extraordinary, Lady Evelyn. You have a rare gift for allowing the music to speak what words cannot express," and she thanked him with a smile that acknowledged both the compliment and the deeper recognition beneath it. But even as she accepted his praise, she was aware of Adrian standing near the fireplace, his posture rigid, his expression unreadable, and when the other guests had added their compliments, and Lady Ashworth had suggested they return to the drawing-room for cards and conversation, Adrian moved toward the piano with a hesitancy that was entirely unlike his usual decisive manner. He stopped a few feet from where she stood, and she saw something working in his face, some emotion struggling to surface through years of deliberate suppression, and when he spoke his voice was lower than usual, pitched for her ears alone beneath the chatter of the departing guests. "My mother used to play that piece," he said, and there was a roughness to the words as though they had been dragged up from some deep place when I was a boy, before she died. She would play it in the evenings, and my father would sit beside her, and they would— He stopped, his jaw clenching, and Evelyn felt her breath catch, because this was the first truly personal thing he had ever shared with her, the first glimpse into the man beneath the cold facade, and she saw pain in his eyes, old grief mixed with something newer and more immediate. And he continued, "I had forgotten, or perhaps I had chosen not to remember, but hearing you play it tonight, I realized that I never asked you about your music, about what you loved or why you played or what the music meant to you. I never asked you anything at all, did I?" Too. And there was such naked remorse in the question that Evelyn felt her carefully constructed defenses waver, felt the anger she had nurtured for 6 years collide with the unexpected tenderness of seeing this proud man, humbled by his own recognition of what he had failed to do. She looked at him, truly looked at him, and saw that he was waiting for her response as though it might determine something crucial, and she found she could not speak past the tightness in her throat, could only shake her head slightly, and the movement seemed to pain him more than any words might have done, and he nodded once, accepting the condemnation, before saying quietly, "Would you allow me the opportunity to learn now, even though I have no right to ask it, even though I squandered every chance you gave me before?" The other guests had moved to the adjacent room, leaving them in this moment of strange intimacy, and Evelyn felt the weight of choice pressing upon her, the safety of retreat warring with the dangerous pull of possibility, and before she could formulate an answer, Lady Ashworth's voice called from the doorway, asking if they would join the others for cards, and the moment fractured, and Evelyn moved past Adrian toward the drawing-room, feeling his eyes follow her progress, and the rest of the evening passed in a blur of polite conversation and whist. But when they finally departed in the small hours of the morning and rode home in Adrian's carriage, he said as they pulled up to their estate, "I would speak with you if you are not too tired. There are things I need to say, things I should have said long ago." And Evelyn looked at his face illuminated by the carriage lamps and saw both hope and fear there, and found herself nodding agreement, even as her heart beat hard with apprehension about what such a conversation might unleash. They entered the library together, and Adrian closed the door behind them with a soft click that seemed to seal them into this moment of reckoning, and Evelyn moved to stand near the fireplace where embers still glowed from the earlier evening fire, needing the warmth against the chill that had settled into her bones despite the spring season. And Adrian remained by his desk, one hand resting on its polished surface as though anchoring himself, and the silence stretched between them until he finally spoke, his voice rough with emotion he had not allowed himself to feel for so many years. "I do not know how to begin this," he said, and she heard the tremor beneath the words, the uncertainty of a man venturing into territory he had deliberately avoided. "I have rehearsed speeches in my mind, but they all sound inadequate to the task of explaining what I have done, what I have failed to do, what I have been." Evelyn turned to face him, her expression guarded but not entirely closed, and she waited, giving him nothing, making him work for whatever absolution he sought. And he seemed to understand this because he drew a breath and continued, "When I married you 6 years ago, it was not with honorable intentions. I married you for reasons that had nothing to do with you as a person. You were a means to an end, a piece in a larger game I was playing, and I am ashamed to admit that I never looked beyond that. Never considered what it would mean for you to be bound to a man who had determined from the outset to be cold and distant." The words fell between them like stones dropped into still water, creating ripples that spread and multiplied, and Evelyn felt pain bloom fresh in her chest because hearing it stated so plainly was different from suspecting it, and she asked quietly, "What game, what end could possibly justify such deliberate cruelty?" And Adrian's face twisted with something that might have been self-loathing as he replied, "I cannot tell you everything, not yet. There are aspects of my motivations that are not mine alone to reveal, and business matters that implicate others, but I can tell you that I was wrong, grievously wrong, to use you as I did, to punish you for circumstances beyond your control." His answer was not enough. She knew that and he knew that, but there was something in his eyes that suggested genuine torment, and she found herself saying, "You speak of using me as though I were an object, a tool, and for 6 years, that is precisely what I have been, a wife in name only, a ghost haunting the halls of a house that was never truly home, and now you appear before me with regrets and half-explanations, and expect what exactly?" Her voice had risen slightly, anger giving it strength, and Adrian flinched but did not look away, accepting her fury as his due, and he said, "I expect nothing, I have no right to expectations, but I am asking, begging if necessary, and for the opportunity to know you as I should have done from the beginning, to learn who you are beyond the role I forced upon you, and to discover if there might be any possibility of building something real from the ruins of what I destroyed before it could even begin." Evelyn looked at him and saw not the cold stranger she had married, but a man genuinely struggling with remorse, and she felt her anger war with a treacherous softening, a crack forming in the walls she had built so carefully around her heart, and she knew that whatever she decided in this moment would determine the course of everything that followed. And finally she said, "I cannot forgive you, not now, perhaps not ever, but I will consider allowing you to try to know me, though I make no promises about what you will find or whether it will be enough." And Adrian's expression transformed with something that looked dangerously close to hope, and he nodded slowly, accepting her terms, and asked softly, "May I begin now? May I ask you about the music, about why you chose that particular piece tonight?" And Evelyn felt tears prick her eyes because it was such a small question, but it represented everything he had never asked before, and she sank into the chair near the fire and began to speak about her mother who had taught her to play, about the consolation music had provided during the loneliest years, about how the Chopin nocturne reminded her of both beauty and sorrow intertwined, and Adrian listened with an attention so focused it was almost painful to witness, and when she finished, he thanked her quietly for trusting him with even that small piece of herself, and they sat together in the library until the fire burned low, not touching, not reconciled, but perhaps beginning the long, difficult journey toward understanding. Weeks passed, like the slow turning of pages in a familiar book, each day marked by small, careful steps towards something that might eventually resemble understanding, and Evelyn found herself caught in a strange new rhythm where morning light would find her and Adrian walking together through the garden paths she had once traversed alone, their footsteps synchronized, though they rarely touched. And at first, these walks were conducted in near silence, broken only by observations about the weather or the progress of the roses. But gradually, as April surrendered to May and the estate bloomed with color, their conversations began to deepen in ways that felt both fragile and significant. Adrian would ask about the books she read and listen with an attention that seemed to memorize every word, as though he was studying for an examination he desperately needed to pass. And Evelyn found herself speaking more freely than she had intended about the novels that had sustained her through the lonely years, about the poetry that had given voice to emotions she could not otherwise express. And once, when she quoted a line from Wordsworth about finding peace in nature, Adrian had completed the verse in a voice rough with disuse, revealing depths she had not suspected. And she had looked at him with surprise that made him confess he had been reading the same volumes from the library, trying to understand what had nourished her spirit in his absence. Lord William continued to call with perfect propriety, bringing flowers and books and engaging her in conversations that ranged from art to philosophy, and Adrian would watch from windows or doorways with an expression that spoke of barely controlled torment. And once, when William had stayed longer than usual, discussing a new translation of Dante they had both read, Evelyn had found Adrian afterward in his study, his hands gripping the edge of his desk as though physically restraining himself. And when she had asked if something troubled him, he had turned to her with eyes that burned with emotions he seemed unable to name, and said only, "I have no right to object to your friendship with Lord Ashford. I forfeited any such rights long ago, but I find myself struggling with demons I did not know I possessed." And the raw honesty of the admission had made her heart beat faster with something that might have been fear, or might have been its opposite. They began taking tea together in the afternoons, and Adrian would attempt small gestures of consideration, remembering how she preferred her tea, ensuring her favorite cakes were served, asking after the welfare of the garden plants she had mentioned. And though these attentions were simple, they represented a fundamental shift from the man who had not noticed her existence for 6 years, and Evelyn felt herself softening despite her determination to remain guarded, felt the walls she had built beginning to develop cracks through which dangerous possibilities might enter. One evening, they sat together in the library reading in companionable silence, she with her volume of poetry and he with correspondence he was attempting to manage, and at one point she reached for a book on the table between them. At the same moment he reached to return his pen to its stand, and their hands came within a breath of touching. So close she could feel the warmth of his skin, though they did not make contact, and both froze in that suspended moment, and Evelyn saw Adrian's chest rise and fall with quickened breathing, saw his eyes fixed on the narrow space between their hands, as though it represented a chasm. He longed to cross but dared not, and she withdrew her hand slowly, carefully, and heard his quiet exhalation that might have been disappointment or relief, or both, and they returned to their reading. But the words on her page had ceased to make sense, and she knew from the way he stared unseeing at his letters that he was equally undone by what had almost happened, by the small, almost touch that represented everything still unspoken between them. Lord William arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, when June sunlight poured through the drawing-room windows and made the room seem too bright for the conversation that was to follow, and Evelyn received him with her customary grace, though something in his manner, a certain determination in the set of his shoulders, a resolved quality to his usually gentle expression, told her that this visit was different from those that had come before. And when he requested a private audience with unusual formality, she felt her heart begin to beat with an irregular rhythm that spoke of both anticipation and dread, and she dismissed the maid who had been sitting as chaperone, knowing that what William had come to say deserved the dignity of privacy, even if it meant bending propriety's rules. He did not sit, but stood near the window with light behind him, making his features difficult to read, and he began by speaking of the friendship that had developed between them over these past months, describing it as one of the great unexpected joys of his return to England. And Evelyn listened with growing certainty about where this conversation would lead, and when he finally turned to face her fully and said, "Mrs. Thorne, Evelyn, I have come to offer you what I hope might be a path toward happiness." She found she was gripping the arms of her chair with white-knuckled intensity. His proposal, when it came, was everything she might have wished for in another lifetime, heartfelt, respectful, painting a picture of partnership and mutual regard, offering her escape from a marriage that had been a prison, promising her a life where she would be valued and cherished and seen. And William spoke of his estate in the countryside, where she might have gardens larger than any she had tended here, of travel to the continent where they might view the art they had discussed in their conversations, as of a future built on genuine affection and shared interests, rather than cold arrangement and colder silence. And he knelt before her chair and took her hand, with a gentleness that made tears spring to her eyes, because she knew she did not deserve his goodness, knew that her heart was treacherously engaged elsewhere despite all logic and self-preservation, screaming that William represented safety, while Adrian represented only the possibility of further pain. Evelyn looked down at William's kind face and felt torn between two futures, one offering the certainty of gentle companionship with a man who had never caused her harm, who had seen her immediately and completely when so many others had looked through her as though she were invisible, and the other offering only the uncertain promise of building something real with a man who had deliberately wounded her for 6 years, who had married her as an act of revenge against sins she had not committed, who even now had not revealed the full truth of his motivations, though his recent attentions suggested genuine transformation, and she realized with something like horror that her heart had already made its choice even as her mind rebelled against such foolishness, and that somewhere in the quiet mornings, walking through gardens and the silent evenings, reading in the library, and the almost touches that had become more frequent, she had begun to hope that Adrian's remorse was real, that the connection growing between them might be the foundation of something worth the risk. She withdrew her hand gently from William's grasp and saw understanding dawn in his eyes even before she spoke, and she said, in a voice thick with emotion, "Lord Ashford, William, you honor me more than you can know with this proposal, and I wish I could accept, with the wholehearted joy such an offer deserves. But I must ask for time to consider, for there are matters in my own heart that I do not yet fully understand, as complications that would be unfair to bring into any new union without first resolving them." And William rose with the grace of a man who had perhaps anticipated this response, and he said quietly, "I understand, or I believe I do, and I will wait for your answer however long you require, but know that my offer stands regardless of how much time you need to examine your heart." And he kissed her hand with old-world courtesy and departed, leaving Evelyn alone in the sunlit room, with her tears falling freely now, because she knew that she was choosing the harder path, the one that offered no guarantees, the one that might lead to deeper heartbreak than she had yet experienced, and yet she could not seem to choose otherwise, could not seem to turn away from the man who had spent 6 years ignoring her existence, but who now looked at her as though she were the answer to questions he had not known to ask. And she sat in that bright room until the shadows grew long, and she finally had to confront what her heart had been trying to tell her for weeks, that she was falling in love with her own husband, and perhaps had been falling for him since that night in the library, when he had asked about her music, and listened as though her answer mattered more than anything else in the world. Evelyn rose the next morning, with resolution settling in her chest like a stone dropped into still water. The decision made in the sleepless hours before dawn that she would go to William and decline his generous offer with the honesty he deserved, and then she would find Adrian and tell him that despite all reason and self-preservation, she was willing to try, and willing to build something real from the ashes of their hollow marriage. But first, she needed him to understand the courage this choice required of her, needed him to see what she was risking by choosing hope over safety, and she dressed with particular care as though armoring herself for battle, and descended the stairs toward Adrian's study where she knew he would be at this hour. But as she approached the heavy oak door, she heard voices within Adrian's familiar deep tones, and another voice she recognized as belonging to Mr. Pemberton, the family solicitor who visited quarterly to discuss estate matters, and she had raised her hand to knock when Adrian's words stopped her mid-gesture, his voice carrying through the door with unusual clarity. "Yes, the marriage served its purpose initially, Pemberton. Revenge against Harrison for what he did to my father's business. Taking his daughter and giving her nothing in return seemed a fitting punishment at the time." The world seemed to tilt beneath Evelyn's feet, and she gripped the doorframe for support as the solicitor's reply came, muffled and indistinct. And then Adrian again. "I know the arrangement appears cruel in retrospect, But you must understand that when my father lost everything because of Harrison's manipulations, when he died broken and disgraced, I swore I would make the man pay, and marrying his precious daughter only to ignore her existence seemed a suitable retribution. And Evelyn felt something inside her chest crack open, like ice breaking under spring thaw. All the small, tender shoots of hope and trust that had been growing these past months, suddenly exposed to killing frost. And she understood with devastating clarity that every kindness Adrian had shown recently, every gentle conversation and tentative touch, had been built on a foundation of calculated cruelty, that she had been not a wife, but a weapon, not a person, but a tool for vengeance against sins her father had committed before she was even born. She must have made some sound, because the voices within stopped abruptly, and the door opened to reveal Adrian's face, and whatever expression she wore made the color drain from his features, as comprehension dawned that she had heard that the truth he had been carefully avoiding could no longer be concealed, and Pemberton gathered his papers and departed with uncomfortable haste, leaving them facing each other across a chasm that had suddenly widened into something that might be unbridgeable. Evelyn found her voice, though it emerged as something barely above a whisper, asking, "Is it true? All of it? Was I truly nothing more than an instrument of revenge? Did you marry me solely to punish my father by making me suffer?" And Adrian's silence was answer enough, though he finally said, "It was true, at the beginning. But Evelyn, you must understand that I have changed, that what I feel for you now is real." But she was shaking her head, because the words that had once meant everything now meant nothing. Every memory recontextualized through this new terrible knowledge, the wedding day where he had looked through her, the 6 years of deliberate invisibility. Even the recent attentions now suspect, because how could she trust that they were genuine rather than another phase of whatever revenge he had planned? She demanded the complete truth with a steadiness that surprised her, and Adrian confessed it all in a voice hollow with despair. How her father had destroyed his father's shipping business through underhanded dealings and false testimony. How the elder Thorne had died in disgrace and poverty. How Adrian had spent years rebuilding the family fortune with the singular purpose of making Harrison pay. How marrying Evelyn had been the final piece of his revenge, taking Harrison's beloved only daughter and condemning her to a half-life of loneliness and neglect. And he spoke of how his feelings had begun to shift when he saw her dancing with William, how the week since had shown him the depth of what he had destroyed, how he had fallen in love with the woman he had married to punish. But Evelyn was no longer listening because the pain was too vast to contain. 6 years of suffering suddenly given context and meaning that made it somehow worse, and she felt herself breaking apart like a ship against rocks. All the careful composure she had maintained dissolving into grief and rage, and a betrayal so complete it seemed to hollow her out from within. Adrian reached for her, and she recoiled as though his touch might burn, and she saw him flinch at the rejection, but she could not bring herself to care, could not access anything beyond the anguish of understanding that she had never been seen as human, that her pain had been the point, that the man she had been foolish enough to begin loving had orchestrated every moment of her suffering with deliberate intent, and she turned and fled up the stairs to her chambers, leaving Adrian standing alone in the corridor with his confession hanging in the air like smoke from a fire that had consumed everything worth saving. And she locked her door and collapsed onto the floor and wept with a violence that seemed to tear something fundamental inside her, mourning not just the marriage that had been a lie, but the fragile new thing that had been growing between them, the tender possibility that had been revealed as just another illusion. And in his study below, Adrian sat with his head in his hands, knowing that he had finally lost what he had only just realized he desperately wanted to keep, that the truth he had hidden had done exactly what truth always does. When kept in darkness, it had grown into something that destroyed everything it touched. 3 days passed in silence that settled over the estate like snow, muffling all sound, and Evelyn remained in her chambers, while Adrian haunted the corridors below like a ghost condemned to witness what he had destroyed, and she found herself turning William's proposal over in her mind with new perspective, because it represented not just escape, but salvation, a chance to leave behind the ruins of a marriage built on vengeance, and begin again with a man whose kindness had never wavered, whose regard had been genuine from the first moment. And yet, even as she recognized the wisdom of accepting his offer, She could not quite bring herself to pen the letter that would seal her decision, could not quite extinguish the stubborn flame of something that still burned, despite all reason, telling her it should have died the moment she learned the truth. She emerged on the fourth morning to find Adrian had not slept, the servants whispering that he had spent each night in his study staring at nothing, eating nothing, and she steeled herself against the sympathy such reports tried to evoke, because she reminded herself that he had orchestrated 6 years of her suffering with deliberate calculation, that whatever pain he experienced now was merely a fraction of what he had inflicted upon her, and yet when she encountered him in the corridor and saw the devastation in his features, she felt something twist inside her chest that felt dangerously like compassion. Mrs. Hartley, the elderly housekeeper who had served the Thorne family for 40 years and who had watched Evelyn's lonely existence with increasing distress, found her in the garden that afternoon and sat beside her on the stone bench with the familiarity of long service, and she spoke quietly of things she had observed. These past months, how Adrian had questioned her extensively about Evelyn's preferences and habits, seeking to learn everything he had refused to know for 6 years, how he had ordered her favorite flowers planted throughout the gardens, though he had never mentioned it to Evelyn, how he had been reading the same books she read, as though trying to understand her mind through the pages she touched. "And Mrs. Hartley said with gentle certainty, "I do not excuse what he did, my dear, the cruelty of those first years, but I have watched him transform from a man consumed by hatred into one consumed by love, and while the former was his choice, the latter seems to have ambushed him against his will, and perhaps that matters for something." Evelyn sat in the fading afternoon light, considering the housekeeper's words and understanding that she stood at a crossroads where both paths led to uncertain futures. William promised safety, but perhaps not passion, companionship, but perhaps not the depth of connection she had begun to glimpse with Adrian, while the other path led through darkness and pain towards something that might become real or might simply be another iteration of suffering. And she realized that the question was not whether Adrian deserved forgiveness, for forgiveness could not be deserved but only given, but rather whether she possessed the courage to choose based on who they both might become rather than who they had been, whether she could build a future on the foundation of genuine transformation rather than the security of starting fresh. She thought of Adrian as he had been in recent weeks, before the truth shattered everything, the careful attention he had paid to her words, the way he had looked at her as though truly seeing her for the first time, the gentle, almost touches that had spoken of desire, tempered by respect. And she thought of the man who had married her to punish her father, and realized they were not the same person, and that somewhere in the space between revenge and remorse, he had become someone different. And while that transformation did not erase the harm he had caused, it suggested the possibility that genuine change was achievable, and that people were not forever defined by their worst actions, but could choose to become better than they had been. As twilight painted the garden in shades of purple and gold, she made her decision not with her heart alone or her mind alone, but with something deeper that acknowledged both the risk and the possibility, and she rose and walked with measured steps toward the house, toward Adrian's study where she knew he would be waiting, though he could not know what answer she brought. And with each step she felt herself choosing not safety over danger, but truth over illusion, choosing to believe that the future did not have to be bound by the past, that two broken people might find a way to heal each other if given the chance. And she lifted her hand and knocked upon the door that had represented barrier and separation for so long, ready now to see if it might instead become a threshold to something new. Adrian looked up when the knock came, and something in his face, hope and fear mingling in equal measure, made Evelyn's resolve strengthen, as she entered and stood before his desk with the composure she had learned through 6 years of surviving what he had intended to destroy her, and she said without preamble, "I am not here to offer forgiveness, Adrian, because forgiveness is not something you can ask for, or I can grant as though it were a transaction, but I am here to say that I am willing to try, to build something real from the wreckage of what you created, though you must understand the terms upon which I offer this possibility." He rose immediately, his eagerness evident but checked by the gravity in her voice, and she continued, "You will tell me everything, every detail of your father's history with mine, every moment of the revenge you planned, every deliberate cruelty you enacted, because I will not build a future on foundations of secrets and partial truths, and you will understand that my choosing to stay is not absolution, but rather an act of faith that people can become better than they were, that you can become the man you have shown glimpses of being these past months, and if at any point I find that faith was misplaced, I will leave, and you will not follow or protest. Adrian's acceptance came not in words, but in the way he bowed his head as though receiving a benediction he knew himself unworthy of, and he said quietly, "I will spend every day of whatever time you grant me proving that your faith is not misplaced, that I can be worthy of the chance you are giving me, and I understand that trust once shattered must be rebuilt fragment by fragment, and I am prepared to do that work however long it takes." And Evelyn nodded once and turned to leave, but paused at the door to add, "We begin tomorrow, slowly and carefully, as two people who hardly know each other but are willing to learn, and perhaps in time we might build something that resembles what a marriage should have been from the start." 3 years passed like water, wearing smooth the sharp edges of stone, and the estate that had been a mausoleum of suffering transformed gradually into something that held warmth and life, the change so incremental that no single moment could be identified as the turning point, but rather it was the accumulation of thousands of small choices. Adrian asking about Evelyn's thoughts and genuinely listening to her. Answers, Evelyn allowing herself to laugh at his wit without guardedness, both of them learning the intricate geography of each other's minds and hearts through patient exploration, and the servants who had witnessed the years of coldness now observed with satisfaction the way their master and mistress moved. And through the halls together, hands occasionally brushing in passing, conversations flowing easily over breakfast, the evidence of genuine partnership built through consistent effort and absolute honesty. The garden where Evelyn had once sought solace in loneliness became instead a place they tended together, and on an afternoon in late spring, with the roses in riotous bloom and the air heavy with the scent of possibility, Evelyn sat on the stone bench, cradling their infant daughter, while Adrian knelt among the flower beds, speaking softly to the child about the different varieties, as though she could understand, and watching them, Evelyn felt something inside her chest that she had thought revenge had killed permanently, the sense of being completely, genuinely happy, not the fragile happiness built on illusion, but the deep satisfaction of knowing she had chosen rightly, had taken the harder path, and found it led somewhere worth reaching. Dear listener, there is something profound in understanding that we are none of us forever bound by our worst moments. That transformation is always possible, though it requires the kind of courage that looks like foolishness to those who have never attempted it. And while Adrian's revenge had been calculated to destroy it, had instead, through the unexpected variable of genuine remorse and Evelyn's extraordinary capacity for grace, created the conditions for something real to grow from, poisoned ground. And perhaps there is wisdom in recognizing that love earned through adversity and built through conscious choice possesses a depth that love granted easily can never quite achieve. If you have known betrayal, if you have suffered at the hands of someone who later sought redemption, know that choosing to trust again does not make you weak, but rather demonstrates a strength most people never access. And while not all who harm us will transform as Adrian did, and while forgiveness should never be offered where genuine change is absent, there remains the possibility that people can surprise us, can become better than they were, can choose love over hatred if given the chance and the proper motivation. May you find the wisdom to know when to offer that chance and when to walk away. May you discover the courage to choose based on who people are becoming rather than who they have been, and may you rest tonight knowing that even the most shattered things can sometimes be rebuilt into something beautiful, though the work is hard and the outcome never guaranteed. May peace find you in the quiet hours, and may you always remember that choosing hope over bitterness is not naivety, but rather the most radical form of strength. This has been a story from Love Chronicles, and if these words have touched something in your heart, consider sharing this tale with someone who might need to hear that redemption is possible, that transformation is real, and that love built slowly and carefully on foundations of truth can weather storms that would destroy lesser things.